On the morning of November 1st, 1755, the city of Lisbon held close to 200,000 people, and within 6 minutes, a significant portion of it stopped existing. The earthquake that struck that morning remains one of the most powerful ever recorded in European history, and it did not arrive alone. It was followed by a wall of water moving up the Tagus River, and then, in the days after, by a fire that burned longer than the earthquake and the flood combined. What came next mattered as much as the destruction itself. A minister who had held no real power that morning would, within a matter of hours, become the person making every decision that determined whether the city survived the week. The buildings that eventually replaced the ruins were constructed using a method of earthquake resistance that would not be formally understood by engineers for another 200 years. And the questions the disaster raised about why a catastrophe of this scale had struck a Catholic capital on a holy day reached philosophers and clergy across Europe who had never seen the city and never would. This account moves through that morning in sequence: the tremor itself, the wave that followed it, the fire that outlasted both, the man who took control of the response, the city that rose from the wreckage, and the thread that connects a Portuguese disaster from 1755 to institutions still standing today. This is Quiet History at Bedtime, and the channel is still finding its audience. If the kind of story that unfolds slowly and precisely holds attention, a subscribe helps more than it might seem right now. This is Quiet History at Bedtime. If this is the kind of story that holds your attention, a subscribe means everything right now. Every detail in this account comes from government archives, legislative records, and current academic research on the period. Just relax and let this play as you drift into sleep. Now, let us begin. In 1755, Lisbon was the capital of an empire that stretched from Brazil to Goa, and its wealth showed in nearly every quarter of the city. Gold from Brazilian mines had been arriving in Portuguese ships for over 4 decades by that point, first from the region of Minas Gerais, discovered in the 1690s, and later supplemented by diamond deposits found in the same territory in the 1720s. Some economic reconstructions placed the total gold shipped from Brazil to Portugal across the 18th century at close to 1,000 tons, a volume large enough to make Lisbon one of the wealthiest capitals in Europe without the crown ever needing to develop a broad domestic industrial base. King João V, who had ruled from 1706 until his death in 1750, spent a significant portion of that wealth on religious architecture and royal display, most visibly in the construction of the Mafra Palace and Convent, a project that at its peak employed more than 45,000 workers and drew craftsmen and materials from across the empire. By the time his son José took the throne in 1750, Lisbon's skyline was dense with the results of that spending. Gilded church interiors, marble facades imported from Italy, and a royal library said to hold nearly 70,000 volumes, along with archives, tracing the administration of Portuguese territories across 3 continents. The wealth was real, and it was visible in the churches especially, where decades of gold imports had been converted into altarpieces, reliquaries, and interior surfaces covered in gilt woodwork. Beyond Brazil, the Portuguese crown in 1755 held territory and trading posts stretching across Angola, Mozambique, Goa on the western coast of India, and Macau on the southern coast of China, a network that made Lisbon one of the central clearing points for goods moving between Europe, Africa, and Asia. The population of the city reflected that global reach, with merchants, sailors, and diplomats from across Europe living alongside a substantial community of enslaved and free Africans, many brought to Lisbon through the same trade networks that carried gold from Brazil. English, Dutch, and other foreign merchants maintained a significant permanent presence in the city as well, since Portugal's trade relationships, particularly the long-standing commercial treaty with England dating back to 1703, meant that a considerable share of Lisbon's import and export trade passed through foreign-run trading houses operating alongside Portuguese ones. This foreign merchant community would later matter to how news of the disaster spread across Europe, since many of these traders maintained regular correspondence with business partners and family members abroad, channels that would carry the first detailed accounts of the earthquake to London, Amsterdam, and other commercial centers within weeks of the event. Population estimates for Lisbon in the years immediately before the earthquake generally placed the city between 180,000 and 275,000 residents, figures that made it, by most contemporary comparisons, larger than most cities in Europe outside of London and Paris. That population was concentrated most densely in exactly the districts that would prove most vulnerable to violent ground motion: the low-lying commercial center near the river, and the older hillside neighborhoods built without any coordinated street planning. But the city built to hold that wealth had not been built with any regard for what was approaching from beneath the Atlantic seabed. Lisbon in 1755 was a city of narrow streets and tall, closely packed buildings, many constructed from a combination of timber framing and rubble masonry that had been added to and modified for generations without any central planning authority reviewing the work. The Baixa district, the low commercial heart of the city near the river, held merchant houses, warehouses, and government buildings packed close enough that residents could often reach across the street from one upper-floor window to another. Buildings in the Baixa commonly rose 4 or 5 stories, added floor by floor as families and merchants expanded upward rather than outward, since horizontal space in the crowded lower city had become scarce generations earlier. The Alfama district, older and built into the hillside east of the Baixa, followed a street plan that dated back to the period of Moorish rule, before the Christian reconquest of the city in 1147, and its layout of tight, winding lanes reflected defensive priorities that had nothing to do with earthquake safety. None of these neighborhoods had been designed with any expectation of a major earthquake, because the region had no strong living memory of one severe enough to shape construction practice. Smaller tremors had been recorded in the Lisbon area across the 16th and 17th centuries, including a damaging earthquake in 1531, but the interval between that event and 1755 was long enough that no builder working in the city that generation had any personal experience of serious seismic damage. Nothing in the city's architecture, its emergency planning, or its civic administration reflected any serious concern about the ground itself as a threat. The government of Portugal in 1755 operated through a structure that gave enormous formal authority to the king, while relying heavily on a small number of secretaries of state to manage the actual business of running the country. José Atun, unlike his father, showed comparatively little personal interest in the daily administration of government, preferring to delegate authority to ministers he trusted and to spend much of his own time on music and the royal opera, both of which he supported generously and which had become a defining feature of his reign. One of those ministers was Sebastião José de Carvalho y Melo, who in 1755 held the position of Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs and War, a senior post, but not the most powerful office in the government. Carvalho y Melo was 56 years old that year, and his career to that point had been built through diplomatic postings in London, where he served as Portuguese envoy in the 1740s, and later in Vienna, rather than through inherited aristocratic prominence. His family held minor noble status, enough to secure him entry into diplomatic service, but not enough on its own to place him among the small circle of powerful court families that dominated Portuguese politics at the time. During his years in London, Carvalho y Melo had observed firsthand how a major European capital managed trade, finance, and civic administration on a scale considerably more centralized than anything then operating in Lisbon. He had studied English agricultural and manufacturing methods closely enough to send detailed reports back to the Portuguese court, reports that marked him, within the government, as a minister with an unusual interest in practical administration rather than court ceremony. That interest had not yet translated into real domestic authority by 1755. His responsibilities as a diplomatic and military minister kept his formal attention focused outward, on foreign relations and the conduct of war, rather than on the internal governance of the capital. He was not, in November of 1755, the most powerful man in the Portuguese government, and he held no particular authority over disaster response, public order, or civil engineering, since no such formal responsibility existed in the structure of the government at all. Portugal in this period had no standing office comparable to a modern emergency management agency, no municipal fire service organized on any significant scale, and no legal framework establishing who, in the event of a citywide catastrophe, would hold the authority to issue binding orders outside the normal chain of royal command. Authority in a crisis, under the existing structure, would fall to whoever the king personally chose to trust with it, a system that depended entirely on the character and judgment of one monarch's private decision, made under pressure, with no established precedent to guide it. That would change within a single day, but on the morning of November 1st he was simply one secretary among several, present in the city along with everyone else, with no indication that the following hours would place the functioning of the entire kingdom in his hands. November 1st was All Saints' Day, one of the most significant dates on the Catholic liturgical calendar, and Lisbon in 1755 was an overwhelmingly Catholic city, with religious observance woven into the rhythm of public life at every level of society. Mass was held that morning in dozens of churches across the city, and because it was a holy day of obligation, attendance was expected to be far higher than on an ordinary Sunday, filling both the grand churches of the city center and the smaller parish chapels scattered through residential districts. Candles had been lit throughout the churches for the morning services, a detail that would matter enormously within a few hours, though no one lighting them that morning had any reason to think so. Kitchen hearths across the city were also lit as usual for a holiday, since All Saints' Day, despite its religious solemnity, was also a day of family gatherings and shared meals in many households. Bakeries had their ovens burning since before dawn, producing bread for a holiday when most households would not cook a full meal themselves. A detail of ordinary commerce that placed open flame in buildings across nearly every district of the city that morning. Households across the social spectrum, from wealthy merchant families in the Baixa to laborers and dock workers in the poorer eastern districts, observed the same holiday calendar, meaning the churches that filled that morning drew worshippers from across nearly every level of Lisbon society rather than any single class. Estimates place a substantial share of Lisbon's population inside churches at the moment the first tremor struck, packed into buildings whose stone vaulting and heavy facades represented some of the tallest and most structurally rigid construction in the entire city, a fact that would prove disastrous rather than protective. Lisbon's major churches had been built and rebuilt over centuries, layering Gothic, Manueline, and Baroque construction styles on top of one another as the city's wealth grew, with each renovation typically adding height, weight, and ornamentation rather than removing it. The Convento do Carmo, completed in the late 14th century and expanded repeatedly afterward, stood as one of the largest Gothic structures in the city, its stone-ribbed vaulting reaching high above the nave in a design intended to draw the eye upward toward the ceiling, rather than to distribute weight laterally in the event of ground movement. That same design logic, tall stone walls, heavy roof structures, and minimal internal bracing, was repeated across dozens of churches throughout the city, because church architecture in this period was built to communicate the wealth and permanence of religious institutions, not to withstand a force that congregations and architects alike had no reason to plan for. The bell towers attached to many of these churches added further concentrated weight at height, structures that swayed, and in a significant number of cases failed entirely once ground motion exceeded what their masonry joints could tolerate. The royal family had left the city the night before, traveling to the palace at Belém, several miles west along the river, reportedly at the request of one of the king's daughters who wished to attend mass there instead of in the city center. That decision, made for reasons entirely unrelated to any coming disaster, placed the king and his immediate family outside the zone of Lisbon's worst structural collapse when the earthquake struck the following morning, a matter of geography rather than foresight. The palace at Belém sat further from the densest concentration of tall stone buildings that would prove most dangerous in the city center. And while the area would not escape the disaster entirely, the difference in exposure between the royal family's location and the crowded churches of the Baixa and Alfama would matter enormously within a matter of hours. José I had reportedly developed a preference for spending nights outside the main royal palace in the years before 1755, a habit with no connection to any anticipation of disaster, but one that historians studying the earthquake's aftermath have noted as a significant factor in the survival of the monarchy's central leadership structure, at a moment when continuity of government mattered enormously. Along the waterfront, the Tagus River was unusually calm that morning, with ships anchored in the harbor and merchants beginning the ordinary business of a holiday morning in a major port city, unloading goods that had arrived from across the empire. The Royal Customs House stood near the river's edge, along with warehouses holding goods that represented a significant fraction of Portugal's trade income: silver, spices, textiles, and the ledgers that tracked the flow of Brazilian gold through the kingdom's finances. In one of the warehouses near the customs house, a shipping clerk, unnamed in any surviving record but representative of the hundreds who worked that stretch of waterfront, would have spent the early morning checking manifests against crates recently unloaded from a Brazilian convoy, the kind of routine paperwork that anchored the empire's wealth to a physical accounting of goods. That clerk's ledgers, like most of the commercial records stored along the Lisbon waterfront that year, existed as the only copies of their kind, since no systematic practice of duplicating trade records in a separate location had developed in a city that had never needed one. The same was true of the royal archives housed closer to the palace, where treaties, land grants, and administrative records stretching back generations were kept in single, irreplaceable copies, a filing practice common across most of Europe at the time and not unique to Portugal. A few streets away, in a modest apartment above a bakery, a widow who supported herself and two young children through needlework, another figure with no name in the surviving record but representative of a category of Lisbon resident common across the crowded Baixa, would have been preparing the same holiday morning her neighbors were, mending clothes to sell, setting bread aside for the household's midday meal, and planning to attend the later Mass at the parish church 2 streets over, rather than the more crowded morning service. That small, unremarkable choice, to attend a later service rather than the earlier one, was the kind of decision made by thousands of Lisbon residents that morning, for reasons having nothing to do with any coming disaster, timing that would, within the hour, place some individuals inside collapsing churches and leave others still walking the streets toward Mass when the ground began to move. None of the people moving through the streets that morning, walking to Mass, opening shops, or unloading cargo along the docks, had any indication that the ground beneath the city had been building toward a rupture for an unknown length of time, somewhere out in the Atlantic seabed to the southwest. Lisbon's position on the map made it, in geological terms, more exposed than its residents understood. Situated near a complex boundary zone where the African and Eurasian tectonic plates interact along a series of faults running through the Atlantic seafloor west of the Iberian Peninsula. That boundary had produced earthquakes before, smaller ones, spaced widely enough across centuries that the pattern was invisible to anyone living through an ordinary human lifespan in the city. The absence of a recent catastrophic earthquake was not evidence that the ground was safe. It was simply the gap between 2 points on a geological timescale far longer than the written memory of the city itself. Modern geological surveys of the seafloor southwest of Portugal have identified several major fault structures in the region, including one now commonly referred to as the Horseshoe Fault, along with a broader zone of complex, still imperfectly mapped tectonic boundaries where the African plate presses against the Eurasian plate at an oblique angle. That oblique motion, rather than a simple head-on collision, is part of why earthquakes generated in this zone can be difficult to model even with modern instruments, since the rupture does not necessarily behave like the more thoroughly studied fault systems along plate boundaries elsewhere in the world. In 1755, none of this vocabulary existed. There was no concept of a tectonic plate, no instrument capable of measuring ground motion at a distance, and no scientific framework connecting the shaking of solid ground to any physical process that could be studied, predicted, or even meaningfully described beyond the fact that it had happened. Earthquakes, where they were discussed at all in European natural philosophy of the period, were more commonly attributed to underground pockets of trapped air, vapor, or fire seeking release, a theory with roots stretching back to Aristotle. and still broadly accepted among educated Europeans in the mid-18th century. That absence of any predictive science meant that whatever was building beneath the Atlantic seabed off the coast of Portugal in the years and decades before 1755 did so entirely outside the awareness of anyone who would be affected by it. The wealth accumulated across half a century of Brazilian gold shipments, the churches built to display it, the narrow streets that had never been planned with any authority overseeing them, and the government structure that concentrated real decision-making in the hands of a small circle of ministers. All of these conditions existed independently of one another, built up over decades for entirely separate reasons. None of them had been designed to interact with a major earthquake, and none of the people who shaped them, the king who funded church construction, the merchants who built warehouses along the river, the clergy who filled their churches with worshippers on holy days, had any reason to consider seismic risk as a factor in their decisions. It was the collision of those ordinary, unconnected choices with an extraordinary geological event that would turn November 1st, 1755, into one of the defining disasters of the 18th century, and the conditions for that collision had been assembling in Lisbon for generations before the ground ever began to shake. No single decision, no single family, and no single institution could be said to have caused what was about to happen. The disaster would instead emerge from the accumulated weight of ordinary choices made across generations, choices about where to build, how to worship, and how to organize a government, none of which had ever been tested against the specific hazard the city was about to face. Shortly before 10 in the morning, in the churches, the warehouses, the palace at Belém, and the narrow streets connecting all of them, the last ordinary moment the city would know for years passed without anyone noticing it as it happened. The first sign of what was coming arrived shortly before 10 o'clock that morning, not as sound at first, but as motion beneath the floors of churches, homes, and warehouses across the city. The tremor reached Lisbon at approximately 9:40 in the morning, and it did not announce itself gradually. Witnesses in different parts of the city later described a sound preceding the shaking, a deep subterranean noise that some compared to distant thunder, and others to the rumble of heavy carts crossing cobblestone all at once, though no carts were moving anywhere near them. The ground motion that followed came in 3 distinct phases rather than a single continuous shake, separated by brief pauses that gave momentary and false hope that the worst had already passed. The first phase lasted under a minute and was strong enough on its own to crack walls and topple loose objects throughout the city. But it was the second phase, beginning perhaps 30 seconds later, that brought the most severe destruction to Lisbon's buildings. A third phase followed the second, weaker than the 2 before it, but still strong enough to bring down structures already weakened, structures that might otherwise have remained standing, however precariously, if the ground had settled after the second shock alone. Inside the warehouse district near the customs house, the shipping clerk introduced earlier in this account a stand-in for the hundreds of similar workers along that stretch of waterfront, would have felt the floor beneath the ledgers shift before any sound reached his ears, the crates around him beginning to slide and topple as the first phase of shaking took hold. By the time the second phase struck, moments later, the building housing those irreplaceable trade records was already failing, and whatever paperwork had tracked that morning's Brazilian convoy would, within minutes, be buried under collapsed masonry, along with the rest of the waterfront's commercial archive. Modern seismological reconstructions, built from historical accounts, geological surveys, and comparison with the region's known fault systems place the earthquake's magnitude at somewhere between 8.5 and 9.0, with an epicenter believed to lie in the Atlantic Ocean, roughly 200 kilometers southwest of Cape St. Vincent, at the southwestern tip of Portugal. At that magnitude, the shaking in Lisbon itself, so far from the epicenter, was still severe enough to level entire buildings, which gives some indication of the scale of energy released offshore, energy that also produced tremors felt as far away as northern Italy and southern France, and reportedly as far as parts of Finland and North Africa. The total duration of strong shaking across all three phases is estimated at between 3.5 and 6 minutes, an extraordinarily long period for an earthquake, and one that gave the city's fragile construction repeated opportunity to fail in ways a shorter event might not have caused. For comparison, most major earthquakes affecting large cities in the historical record last well under a minute of strong shaking. A duration measured in minutes rather than seconds meant that walls and roof structures already cracked by the first phase had no opportunity to settle before the second and third phases arrived to finish the work. Some accounts from sailors anchored in the Tagus that morning described the ships themselves shuddering as though they had run aground, despite sitting in open water at anchor, a detail consistent with modern understanding of how a sufficiently powerful earthquake can transmit shock waves through water in a way felt clearly by vessels floating well above the seafloor. Animals across the city were reported by multiple later accounts to have shown signs of distress in the minutes before the shaking began. Dogs barking without evident cause, and horses pulling against their tethers, though this category of report is common after major earthquakes throughout history and is difficult to verify independently of the disaster itself. The buildings that suffered most immediately and most completely were the churches. Structures built with tall stone facades, heavy roof vaulting and bell towers, designed for visual grandeur rather than lateral flexibility, began collapsing within the earthquake's first phase and continued failing through the second and third. Because the morning's mass had drawn unusually large crowds for the holy day, the human cost of these specific collapses was disproportionate to their number relative to the rest of the city's building stock. The Church of São Domingos, one of the largest in the city and a frequent site of major royal and public ceremonies, came down with worshippers still inside its nave. The Royal Basilica of the Sé, the cathedral seat of the Patriarch of Lisbon, and one of the oldest religious structures in the city, suffered severe structural damage, with portions of its roof and upper walls collapsing during the second phase of shaking. Across the city, dozens of parish churches failed in the same pattern. Heavy stone construction that had stood for generations, undermined by ground motion it had never been designed to withstand, coming down onto congregations gathered for a holy day none of them had any reason to leave early. Outside the churches, the effects varied considerably by construction type and by location within the city. Buildings in the Baixa district, closer to the river and built on looser alluvial soil deposited over centuries by the Tagus, suffered worse structural damage than buildings on the more solid ground of the surrounding hills, a pattern consistent with how seismic waves amplify differently depending on the composition of the ground they travel through. This difference in soil behavior, not yet understood in any scientific sense in 1755, meant that two buildings of similar construction and similar age could suffer entirely different fates, depending on nothing more than which side of a street they happened to stand on, if that street crossed from firmer bedrock onto softer river sediment. The hillside districts, including much of the Alfama and the area around the Castello de San Giorgi overlooking the city, fared comparably better in structural terms, though even there, narrow streets lined with tall buildings meant that falling debris posed a serious danger to anyone caught outdoors during the shaking itself. Building height compounded the danger throughout the city, regardless of district, since a 4- or 5-story structure built without any lateral reinforcement concentrated far more falling material onto the street below than a single-story structure would, a straightforward relationship between construction practice and casualty risk that no builder in Lisbon had any reason to consider before that morning. Streets filled with fallen masonry, broken timber, and dust thick enough that some accounts describe the sky over the city darkening as if evening had come early, obscuring visibility across distances of only a few hundred meters. Survivors, who had been in the streets, in shops, or in buildings that held together well enough to allow escape, began moving instinctively toward open ground, away from structures that might still fail. For a significant number of them, that instinct led toward the waterfront. The area along the Tagus River, particularly the open plaza known as the Terreiro do Passo in front of the Royal Palace, seemed like the safest available space in a city where every standing structure was now suspect. It was flat, it was open, and it was as far from falling masonry as a person could get without leaving the city center entirely, a calculation that made sense given everything the survivors could see and understand about the danger they had just escaped. Open squares and riverfronts had, for generations, served as informal gathering points during the smaller emergencies a dense medieval city occasionally produced. Minor building fires, isolated wall collapses, disputes that drew a crowd, and the instinct to head for open ground carried forward into a catastrophe of an entirely different scale. No civic authority had ever instructed Lisbon's residents on where to gather during a disaster of any kind, since no formal emergency planning existed, which meant the crowd's movement toward the waterfront was a spontaneous, city-wide repetition of the same individual judgment made independently by thousands of people who had no way of coordinating with one another. Thousands of people made their way there in the confused hour after the earthquake's shaking finally stopped, some carrying injured family members, some simply following the crowd toward what appeared to be the one place in Lisbon where nothing could fall on them. Among them, by later accounts, was a considerable number of clergy and churchgoers who had survived the collapse of their own parish churches only to make their way, dazed and often injured, toward the same waterfront plaza that thousands of others across the city had independently chosen as the safest refuge available. A merchant family from the Basha, unnamed in any surviving account, but typical of the households that populated that district, might have made the same journey that morning. Parents and children separated briefly in the collapse of their home, reunited in the street outside, and moving together toward the river on the same instinct that drew nearly everyone else in the crowd. Their possessions, whatever they managed to carry out before the building came down, would have counted for little in the hour that followed, since the plaza offered no shelter, no food, and no clear sense of what came next, only the temporary reassurance of open sky overhead instead of a roof that might fall. That reassurance lasted less than an hour, and when the wave arrived, A family that had survived the collapse of their own home only through chance and quick movement now faced the same wall of water as everyone else gathered on the same exposed ground. What none of them could have known, standing on that open plaza and looking out at the river, was that the earthquake's most dangerous after effect had not yet arrived, and that the location they had chosen for safety was about to become one of the most dangerous places in the entire city. In the minutes after the shaking stopped, witnesses along the waterfront noticed something happening to the river itself. The Tagus, calm that morning before the earthquake, began to withdraw from its banks, exposing riverbed and mudflats that were normally submerged, along with the wrecks of older vessels that had not been visible in living memory. Ships anchored in the harbor were left sitting at unusual angles as the water beneath them dropped, and some crews reported seeing fish stranded on newly exposed ground where deep water had stood only minutes before. This retreat of the water is now understood as one of the clearest warning signs of an approaching tsunami, caused by the same seafloor displacement that had produced the earthquake. But in 1755, no framework existed for interpreting it that way. Nothing in Portuguese coastal experience, and nothing in the accumulated knowledge available to anyone standing on that plaza, connected a retreating river to an incoming wave, since the word tsunami itself would not enter European scientific vocabulary for well over another century. The mechanism behind the retreat is now well understood. The same seafloor rupture that generates the earthquake also displaces an enormous volume of ocean water, and depending on the geometry of that displacement, coastal water can be drawn seaward before the resulting wave arrives, a sequence that has repeated itself in documented tsunamis around the world in the centuries since, from Japan to Indonesia to the Pacific coast of the Americas. In each of those later disasters, the pattern of receding water, followed by a returning wave, has claimed lives, specifically because observers, lacking any warning system or prior education about the phenomenon, moved toward the exposed seabed rather than away from it. The same fatal instinct that operated on the Lisbon waterfront in 1755, centuries before any of those later events gave the pattern a name. The 1755 event is, in fact, among the earliest tsunamis in European history, for which enough written testimony survives to reconstruct the sequence of withdrawal and return in any detail, which is part of why the disaster later became a reference point for scientists beginning to study the phenomenon systematically, long after the last of the eyewitnesses had died. That later scientific attention lay generations in the future. On the afternoon of November 1st, 1755, the only fact available to anyone standing in the ruins of the Terreiro do Passo was that the water had come, the wave had struck, and the safest place in the city had failed to protect them. Some witnesses reportedly walked out onto the newly exposed riverbed out of simple curiosity, drawn toward the strange sight of a harbor floor that was normally underwater, an impulse consistent with how coastal populations elsewhere in history have responded to the same warning sign, almost always without understanding what it meant until it was too late to act on it. Approximately 40 minutes after the earthquake's shaking had ended, the water returned, not as a gradual rise, but as a wall moving up the river with considerable speed and force. Contemporary accounts describe the wave reaching heights of several meters as it moved up the river and struck the crowded waterfront, though estimates vary by location and by source, with the highest reported surges concentrated near the mouth of the Tagus, where the geography of the coastline funneled the incoming water into a narrower channel and amplified its height. The Terreiro do Passo, the plaza that thousands had fled toward as the safest open space in the city, was struck directly by the surge. The wave did not arrive as a single event either. Witnesses described at least two, and in some accounts three, successive waves, separated by intervals of retreat, each one pushing further into the city than expected before pulling back out toward the river again. Buildings along the waterfront that had survived the earthquake's shaking were struck by the force of moving water carrying debris, small boats, and the wreckage of structures already destroyed upstream and along the harbor. The Royal Customs House, standing directly on the waterfront and holding a considerable share of the kingdom's trade records and stored goods, was severely damaged by the surge, with water reaching well into the ground floor storage areas. Warehouses along the same stretch of riverfront, already weakened by the earthquake's shaking less than an hour earlier, gave way more easily to the added force of moving water than they would have as intact structures, compounding losses that had already begun before the first wave ever arrived. Goods that had survived the earthquake itself, bales of imported cloth, casks of wine awaiting export, crates of Brazilian sugar stacked for shipment north, were scattered and ruined by the flood in a matter of minutes, a second wave of commercial loss layered directly on top of the first. Ships anchored in the harbor were driven from their moorings, some pushed onto the newly flooded plaza itself, coming to rest among the crowd that had gathered there less than an hour earlier, believing they had reached the safest ground available to them in the entire city. The precise number of people killed by the waves specifically, as distinct from the earthquake or the fire that would follow, is not something the surviving records allow anyone to state with confidence, because the three disasters overlapped in time and in space closely enough that contemporary accounts rarely separated one cause of death from another with any precision. What the records do make clear is the geography of the wave's reach. Accounts describe water moving well inland from the river's normal edge, flooding streets and lower floors of buildings that stood at a distance from the waterfront that would have seemed entirely safe under ordinary conditions before that morning. The wave's effects were not limited to Lisbon itself. Coastal towns along the Portuguese Algarve, further south along the coast, and points along the Spanish and North African coastlines also reported unusual and often destructive wave activity that same day, consistent with a tsunami generated by a seafloor rupture large enough to send waves across a significant stretch of the Atlantic coastline, not merely up a single river in a single city. Some accounts, examined by later researchers, describe unusual wave activity recorded as far away as the Caribbean, arriving hours after the wave struck the Portuguese and North African coastlines, consistent with the immense distance a tsunami generated by an earthquake of this scale could travel across open ocean. In Morocco, the coastal city of Agadir reported significant destruction and loss of life from the same wave system, compounding a disaster that, by the standards of the period, had no precedent for how far its physical effects extended beyond the epicenter itself. Reports reaching European capitals over the following weeks pieced together a picture of a single geological event whose consequences had touched 3 continents within the span of a single morning and afternoon: Europe, Africa, and, in its most attenuated form, the Americas. Communication across those distances in 1755 moved no faster than a ship could sail or a rider could travel overland, which meant that the full scale of the disaster's geographic reach would not be understood in any single place, including Lisbon itself, for weeks after the event, as fragmentary reports arrived, were compared, and were gradually assembled into something resembling a complete picture. Inside the city, no such delay applied to the immediate physical experience of the disaster. The water had struck, receded, and struck again, all within the same hour, and the reckoning of what remained standing was only beginning. In Lisbon, as the final wave withdrew and the water settled back into something resembling its normal course, survivors were left standing in a landscape that had been reorganized twice within the span of little more than an hour. First by the ground itself failing beneath the city's buildings, and then by a flood that had struck the one place many of them had chosen specifically because it seemed impossible for anything to reach them there. The plaza that had drawn thousands seeking safety was now littered with wreckage, stranded boats, and the debris of a waterfront that no longer resembled the one that had existed at 9 o'clock that morning. Survivors moved back from the water's edge, uncertain whether the river might rise again, uncertain what remained standing anywhere else in the city, and uncertain, in the confusion of the early afternoon, whether the day's disasters had already run their course. They had not. Across the ruined city, in kitchens where cooking fires had been left untended in the chaos of the earthquake, in churches whose altar candles had never been extinguished before their buildings collapsed around them, and in bakeries whose ovens had been burning since before dawn for the holiday, small fires were already beginning to catch in the wreckage. These fires went largely unnoticed in the immediate aftermath of the wave, as survivors focused entirely on the more visible threats of collapsing structures and rising water, and they were about to become the third, and in terms of total destruction, the longest-lasting disaster of the day. Unlike the earthquake, which had lasted minutes, and the tsunami, whose waves had come and gone within roughly an hour, the fire that was now spreading through the wreckage of Lisbon would not be finished with the city for nearly 5 more days. For the merchant family now standing in the open plaza, along with the thousands of others gathered around them, the fire's first smoke would still have been indistinguishable from the general haze of dust and debris hanging over the ruined city. One more gray column among many, not yet recognizable as the beginning of a third and separate catastrophe, layered on top of the 2 they had already survived that morning. By early afternoon on November 1st, isolated fires burning in dozens of separate locations across the city, kitchen hearths, bakery ovens, unattended altar candles, had begun spreading into the collapsed timber and debris that now covered most of central Lisbon. Under ordinary circumstances, a fire breaking out in any single building might have been contained by neighbors, by whatever informal bucket and ladder response a crowded city could organize, or simply by the stone walls that typically separated one structure from the next. November 1st, 1755, offered none of those ordinary conditions. The earthquake had reduced much of the city to loose timber, broken furniture, and collapsed roof structures, material that burned far more readily than intact buildings would have, and the debris lay piled across streets that had, only hours earlier, served as the only paths between one part of the city and another. Those same streets were now choked with rubble in many places, which meant that even where organized firefighting might otherwise have been attempted, there was frequently no way to move people, water, or equipment to where the flames were spreading. The width of Lisbon's older streets compounded the problem further, since many of the lanes running through the Alfama and parts of the Baixa had never been built wide enough to accommodate anything beyond foot traffic and the occasional handcart, long before anyone imagined those same streets would need to carry emergency response of any kind. A fire that might have been contained within a single block in a more open city instead had a continuous path of debris and narrow, blocked passages along which to spread, block by block, through neighborhoods where houses stood close enough to share walls in many cases. The compounding effect of dense construction, blocked streets, and a disabled water supply meant that individual acts of courage and improvisation and surviving accounts describe residents forming bucket lines from whatever water source remained reachable, could slow the fire's advance in isolated pockets but had no realistic chance of stopping its overall progress through the center of the city. Lisbon in 1755 had no dedicated municipal fire brigade in the sense a modern city would recognize, no trained corps equipped and drilled specifically to respond to structure fires. What existed instead was a patchwork of informal responses coordinated at the neighborhood level. Residents forming chains to pass buckets of water from the nearest well or cistern, a system adequate for a single contained fire but entirely unequal to a citywide conflagration, breaking out simultaneously in dozens of locations at once. That water supply problem was made significantly worse by the tsunami. Cisterns and wells nearer the waterfront had been fouled or damaged by the flooding less than an hour after the fires began, and the Aguas Libres aqueduct, then still under construction and not yet fully operational across the city, offered no reliable alternative source for firefighting on the scale the moment demanded. With water scarce, access blocked, and no organized command structure directing any citywide response, the fires that had started as isolated outbreaks in scattered kitchens and chapels merged over the following hours into a continuous front moving through the ruined city. By the evening of the first day, observers stationed on the surrounding hills, in districts the fire had not yet reached, described the city center as a single expanse of flame, visible from a considerable distance, a sight distinct enough that some accounts compared it to viewing an entire town burning at once, rather than a collection of separate structure fires. Ash and smoke reportedly darkened the sky over Lisbon for a significant part of the following days, thick enough in places to affect visibility well beyond the immediate area of the fire itself, a secondary effect that made coordinating any response even more difficult for the people attempting it. Wind patterns on the day are recorded inconsistently across surviving accounts, but several sources describe conditions that helped the fire spread rather than contained it, carrying embers across streets and gaps that might otherwise have served as natural fire breaks. The fire's path through the city was not uniform, and some neighborhoods, particularly in the western districts further from the dense commercial core, escaped its worst effects entirely. The Baixa, already the most severely damaged district from the earthquake and the area closest to the tsunami's reach, suffered the most complete destruction from the fire as well, meaning that for a significant portion of central Lisbon, the three disasters did not simply overlap, but compounded directly on top of one another in the same physical space. Buildings that had partially survived the earthquake's shaking, standing damaged but upright, were consumed by the fire over the days that followed, converting structural damage into total loss for a considerable share of the city's remaining building stock. Among the losses attributed specifically to the fire rather than to the earthquake or the wave was the Royal Library, the collection of nearly 70,000 volumes and extensive government archives housed near the palace complex. Manuscripts, royal charters, and administrative records documenting generations of Portuguese governance, some of which had no copy existing anywhere else in the empire, burned along with the building that had held them. Among the losses reported by later assessments were records relating to Portugal's overseas territories, documentation that had tracked administrative decisions across Brazil, Angola, and the Indian territories for decades, a gap in the historical record that would complicate colonial administration for years after the immediate crisis in Lisbon itself had passed. The Ribeira Palace, the primary royal residence in the city center, which had already suffered severe structural damage from the earthquake, was further consumed by the fire over the following days, along with the opera house King José Bedtime had built specifically to house the elaborate musical productions he sponsored throughout his reign. The palace complex had also housed a substantial art collection, including paintings by European masters acquired over decades through the crown's considerable purchasing power. Works lost in the same fire that consumed the building meant to display them. That opera house, completed only months before the earthquake at considerable royal expense, burned to the ground, having hosted performances for less than a full season. The building had been constructed largely of wood, despite its lavish interior decoration, a choice that had made it possible to complete quickly and cheaply relative to a stone structure of comparable scale, and that same choice left it with almost nothing capable of resisting the fire once the surrounding district began to burn. Government offices housing tax records, property deeds, and the accumulated paperwork of a centralized monarchy that had for decades tracked revenue flowing in from across the empire were lost in the same days, a loss whose administrative consequences would complicate Portuguese governance for years after the physical rebuilding of the city had begun. Property boundaries in particular became a persistent source of dispute during the reconstruction period, since without deeds to consult, determining which family had owned which parcel of now vacant land often came down to memory, testimony, and negotiation rather than documentary proof. Religious institutions, having already suffered heavily in the earthquake's initial collapse, suffered further losses in the fire that followed. Convents and monasteries throughout the city, many holding their own libraries, religious art, and administrative records accumulated over centuries, were destroyed as the fire moved through districts the earthquake alone had only partially damaged. Religious paintings and sculpture, some commissioned generations earlier and irreplaceable in the most literal sense, were lost alongside the buildings that had housed them, a category of destruction that contemporary accounts noted with particular attention given the depth of Portuguese royal and public investment in religious art across the preceding half-century. Hospitals fared no better than the churches situated near them, and the Hospital Real de Todos os Santos, the city's principal public hospital, was largely destroyed by the fire after having already been damaged by the earthquake, a compounding loss that removed exactly the kind of medical capacity the city most urgently needed in the days immediately following the disaster. Patients already inside the hospital at the time of the earthquake faced a second emergency evacuation as the fire approached, moved through streets choked with rubble by staff and volunteers working with whatever means were available, a detail preserved in several surviving accounts, specifically because of how starkly it illustrated the compounding nature of the day's disasters. The loss of the hospital's stores of medical supplies and equipment, difficult to replace quickly in a kingdom whose main port and principal warehouse district had themselves just been destroyed, left the city with severely limited capacity to treat the injured at precisely the moment injuries from the earthquake The wave, and now the fire, were arriving in overwhelming numbers. Among the hospital's staff that day, by later accounts, was a young surgeon's assistant, a figure who appears in no formal register, but whose actions stand in for the junior medical staff who kept the evacuation moving, remembered only through a brief mention of directing a line of walking patients away from the burning wards toward the open ground of a nearby square. A single, unremarkable act of coordination repeated in some form by countless unnamed staff across the city's ruined institutions that same afternoon. Such acts, performed by clerks, porters, and junior staff whose names appear in no official register of the disaster, made up the bulk of whatever organized response existed in those first chaotic hours before any formal authority had begun directing the city's recovery. The human cost of the combined disaster, earthquake, tsunami, and fire together, is one of the most difficult figures for anyone examining the historical record to establish with confidence. And the uncertainty is not a modern gap in research so much as a reflection of how completely the disaster disrupted the very institutions that would ordinarily have kept such records. Parish registers that might have tracked deaths in the ordinary course of events were themselves destroyed in many districts, along with the churches that housed them and, in some cases, the clergy who would have recorded the information. Estimates of total deaths from the combined disaster generally range between 10,000 and 40,000 people, a range wide enough to reflect genuine uncertainty rather than simple imprecision, out of a pre-disaster population of roughly 200,000. The width of that range itself became, in later scholarship, a small case study in the limits of historical demography, since the same underlying event produced radically different figures depending on which contemporary source a researcher chose to trust, and no single archive survived intact enough to resolve the disagreement definitively. Some later historians have argued for figures toward the lower end of that range, based on comparison with the city's known pre-disaster population registers, where such registers survived outside the burned districts, while others have argued that the true toll likely sits higher, given how many deaths would have gone entirely unrecorded amid the destruction of the very institutions responsible for keeping such records. Some contemporary estimates circulated in the weeks after the disaster placed the toll considerably higher, driven partly by the genuine chaos of the moment and partly by the difficulty of distinguishing confirmed deaths from missing persons who might yet have escaped the city entirely. Compounding the uncertainty further, a portion of Lisbon's population fled the city in the days immediately following the disaster, moving to the surrounding countryside or to relatives in other Portuguese towns, which meant that anyone attempting a count in the weeks afterward faced a population that was simultaneously grieving confirmed losses, searching for missing family members, and actively dispersing away from the ruined capital. Later administrative surveys, commissioned specifically to assess the scale of the damage for the purposes of planning a response, would eventually provide the closest thing available to a systematic accounting. Though even those surveys, discussed further later in this account, focused primarily on structural damage and population displacement rather than a precise death toll. What is not in dispute is the proportion of the city's physical structure that was lost. Later assessments conducted during the reconstruction period found that a substantial majority of Lisbon's buildings, by some counts as many as 85% of structures in the city center, had been destroyed or rendered unusable by some combination of the three disasters. These assessments, commissioned in the months after the disaster as part of the planning process for reconstruction, represent some of the earliest examples of a government conducting a systematic survey of disaster damage before beginning to rebuild, a methodical approach that stood apart from how most European governments of the period would have responded to a catastrophe of comparable scale. Churches suffered losses disproportionate even to that already severe average, with the overwhelming majority of the city's parish churches, chapels, and religious institutions destroyed or severely damaged across the combined events of that single day and the days of fire that followed it. Foreign residents and merchants in the city, whose trading houses had operated alongside Portuguese firms for generations, suffered losses in proportion to their presence in the districts hit hardest, since the Baixa, home to much of the foreign commercial community, was also the district where the earthquake, tsunami, and fire overlapped most completely. Correspondence sent from these merchant houses to trading partners in London, Amsterdam, and Hamburg in the weeks following the disaster provided some of the most detailed surviving eyewitness accounts of the event, since these letters were written specifically to convey information rather than to serve any devotional or memorial purpose, and many were later published or circulated widely enough in European commercial and scientific circles to shape how the disaster was understood outside Portugal itself. Diplomatic staff stationed in Lisbon representing other European powers filed similar reports to their home governments, reports that today form part of the archival record historians rely on to reconstruct events that Portuguese administrative records, themselves partly destroyed in the fire, can no longer fully document on their own. Throughout the disaster, the royal family remained at the palace complex in Belém, several miles from the worst of the fires spread through the city center, a location that had already placed them outside the earthquake's most severe structural damage, and that now kept them beyond the fire's reach as well. King José Ahort, by accounts from those attending him in the days immediately following the disaster, showed a marked reluctance to remain inside any enclosed structure, a response consistent enough with the scale of what had just destroyed the heart of his capital, that later observers rarely treated it as unusual. That reluctance was, by some accounts, shared broadly across the surviving population of the city, since aftershocks continued intermittently for days and, in diminishing frequency, for weeks after the initial earthquake, giving anyone who had lived through the first collapse ample reason to distrust any structure still standing. Tents, improvised wooden shelters, and open-air encampments became the dominant form of housing across much of Lisbon and its immediate surroundings for an extended period following the disaster, a temporary arrangement that, for a considerable number of residents, stretched on for months rather than the days or weeks that might have been expected. The court would in fact spend an extended period living in tents and temporary pavilions erected in the gardens at Belém, an arrangement that persisted for a considerable stretch of time, even after more permanent shelter might have been arranged, reflecting the scale of disruption the disaster had caused, even to the institutions of government furthest removed from its physical destruction. That reluctance meant that for a period stretching well beyond the initial emergency, the functioning center of Portuguese royal government operated not from any palace or formal seat of administration, but from canvas structures in a garden, several miles removed from a capital that was, in significant portions, still smoldering. Foreign ambassadors accredited to the Portuguese court found themselves conducting official business in the same improvised conditions. meeting with ministers in tents rather than the formal chambers diplomatic protocol would ordinarily have required, an adjustment that several diplomatic reports from the period noted specifically as evidence of how completely the disaster had disrupted even the ordinary machinery of a functioning royal government. Aid and expressions of sympathy began arriving from other European courts within weeks, once news of the disaster's scale had traveled by ship and overland courier to London, Madrid, and beyond. Though the practical value of most of this early response was limited by the same communication delays that had slowed the spread of accurate information about the disaster in the first place. England, bound to Portugal by a long-standing alliance and by the commercial treaty that had brought so many English merchants to Lisbon's waterfront, dispatched financial assistance and supplies in the weeks following the disaster, one of the more substantial instances of direct international disaster relief recorded in 18th century Europe. The British Parliament authorized a grant of relief funds specifically earmarked for Lisbon within weeks of receiving confirmed reports of the disaster's scale, a decision debated and passed with unusual speed relative to the normal pace of 18th century government business, reflecting both the closeness of the Anglo-Portuguese alliance and the scale of destruction the earliest reports had already conveyed. It was into this vacuum, a monarch unwilling to occupy any permanent structure, a capital largely destroyed, a government with no established procedure for responding to a disaster of this scale, that Sebastião José de Carvalho y Melo stepped, not because any formal process had placed him there, but because someone needed to act, and in the days immediately following November 1st, he was the minister who did. Nothing in his prior service as a diplomat had specifically prepared him for organizing burial details, food distribution, and public order across a devastated capital, and no precedent existed in Portuguese government for the kind of centralized emergency authority the moment now seemed to require. According to accounts that have become central to how this moment is remembered, the king, overwhelmed by the scale of what had happened and uncertain how to proceed, turned to Carvalho y Melo directly and asked what should now be done. The response attributed to him, whatever its precise original wording, set the direction for everything that followed in the weeks and months ahead. The dead needed to be buried, and the living needed to be fed. That directive, brief and unsentimental, left no room for the kind of prolonged public mourning a disaster of this scale might otherwise have produced, and it set an operational tone that would characterize the entire response over the weeks that followed. Everything Carvalho y Melo would order in the days ahead, the burial details, the food requisitions, the soldiers posted at street corners, traced back to that single, unadorned instruction. That simple formulation, prioritizing immediate practical necessity over ceremony, mourning, or theological reflection, would define the character of the response Portugal's government mounted over the following days. A response that placed one minister, previously a competent but unremarkable Secretary of State, at the center of every major decision the kingdom would make in the aftermath of its worst disaster in centuries. There was no formal transfer of authority, no decree naming Carvalho y Melo to any new office in those first days, only a king unwilling to make decisions himself and a minister willing to make them, a dynamic that would harden over the following months into one of the most consequential concentrations of political power in Portuguese history. Other ministers and members of the traditional aristocracy, some of whom had held more prestigious positions than Carvalho y Melo before the disaster, found themselves sidelined in practice by a colleague who simply began issuing instructions and organizing a response, while the formal machinery of government remained, in the days immediately following the earthquake, effectively suspended. That imbalance, a diplomat's son from a minor noble family displacing better connected rivals through sheer willingness to act under conditions no one else in the government seemed prepared to manage, would shape Portuguese politics for the following 2 decades, though in the first week of November 1755 it registered simply as one minister taking charge of a crisis that urgently needed someone to take charge of it. What that response actually required, in specific and often difficult terms, is where the story of Lisbon's recovery genuinely begins. Burying the dead, feeding the living, restoring some semblance of public order, and stopping panic from spreading through a population that had just watched its capital destroyed in a single day. These were the 4 problems now sitting on Carvalho e Melo's desk, none of them with any established Portuguese precedent for how a government should solve them. The most immediate problem facing Carvalho e Melo in the first days of November was the sheer number of dead bodies lying among the wreckage across the city, a public health hazard of a scale Lisbon's ordinary burial infrastructure had no capacity to handle. Physicians and clergy who moved through the ruined districts in the days immediately following the disaster warned repeatedly of the risk that unburied remains posed to the survivors still living among the wreckage, a concern rooted in the practical medical understanding of the period, even without any precise knowledge of disease transmission in the modern sense. Parish cemeteries, already limited in a city of nearly 200,000 people even under ordinary circumstances, could not accommodate a death toll that ran into the thousands within the space of a single day, and the destruction of many churches meant that even the physical grounds normally used for burial were themselves inaccessible or buried under rubble. Carvalho e Melo's response was to order that a significant number of the dead be transported by barge out into the mouth of the Tagus and buried at sea, a decision that departed sharply from standard Catholic burial practice, which called for consecrated ground and individual funeral rites for the deceased. Weighted and secured for the crossing downriver, the bodies were taken beyond the river's mouth and committed to the ocean in batches, a method chosen not for any ceremonial reason, but because it was the fastest available means of removing a mounting public health hazard from a city that had no functioning system left to process death at this scale through ordinary means. The order provoked resistance from segments of the clergy, for whom sea burial without individual last rites represented a serious violation of proper religious observance. But the alternative, allowing bodies to remain in the streets and ruins as disease risk mounted in the days after the disaster, was judged the greater danger. Boats were requisitioned for the task, and over the days following the disaster, a steady traffic of vessels carried the dead from the ruined waterfront out past the river's mouth, a grim continuation of the same stretch of water that, only days earlier, had carried the tsunami into the heart of the city. Fishermen and sailors, whose own boats had survived the wave, found themselves conscripted into this new and unfamiliar duty, piloting the same vessels that had, days before, been used for trade and transport, now committed to a task that had no precedent in the ordinary working life of Lisbon's waterfront. The precise number of dead handled this way is not recorded with any exactness, consistent with the broader uncertainty surrounding the total death toll. But contemporary accounts describe the sea burials as a sustained operation carried out over multiple days rather than a single response to the immediate emergency. Some clergy, who objected most strongly to the practice, were permitted to perform abbreviated blessings over the barges before they departed downriver, a compromise that satisfied neither the strict demands of traditional burial rites nor the administration's urgency to clear the streets quickly, but one that allowed the operation to continue without provoking the kind of open confrontation between church and state that might have further destabilized a city already in crisis. The bishops of Lisbon, several of whom had themselves lost churches, colleagues, and in some cases family members in the disaster, were divided in their response to the sea burials, with some publicly supporting the practical necessity of the measure and others privately regarding it as a troubling departure from the Church's proper authority over the treatment of the dead. Alongside the burial crisis, Carvalho and Melo faced an immediate breakdown in public order. In the chaos following the earthquake, tsunami, and fire, looting became a significant problem across the ruined city, with abandoned shops, damaged warehouses, and the property of families who had fled or died presenting an obvious and largely unguarded target. The scale of the crisis meant that in the earliest hours after the disaster, no meaningful barrier stood between an unguarded warehouse of valuable goods and anyone willing to take advantage of a city where ordinary policing had, for the moment, simply ceased to function. Some of those accused of looting in the disaster's immediate aftermath were reportedly not Lisbon residents at all, but opportunists who had traveled toward the city specifically because word of the disaster and the disorder it had created had spread quickly to surrounding towns. This pattern, outsiders converging on a devastated city precisely because its normal defenses against crime had collapsed along with its buildings, was noted with particular concern by officials attempting to distinguish desperate survivors salvaging their own property from opportunists exploiting a catastrophe that was not their own. Foreign sailors from ships anchored in the harbor were also implicated in some contemporary accounts of looting, though the reliability of these specific claims varies considerably across surviving sources, some of which may have reflected pre-existing tensions between Portuguese residents and the foreign merchant community rather than confirmed criminal activity. Carvalho and Melo's response to this threat was direct and severe. Gallows were erected at multiple points across the city, and looting was made a capital offense, with the death penalty applied swiftly and publicly to those caught in the act. The gallows themselves, constructed quickly from salvaged timber in some cases, were deliberately positioned in visible locations across the ruined districts, a choice consistent with the broader logic of the policy, which relied on visible, immediate deterrence rather than any expectation that formal trials could be conducted at the pace the crisis demanded. Executions carried out under this order were reportedly witnessed by significant crowds among the surviving population, and while surviving accounts do not provide a reliable total figure for how many individuals were executed under this policy in the weeks following the disaster, the consistency with which contemporary sources reference the gallows suggests the measure was applied with real frequency rather than existing chiefly as a symbolic threat. Military units, placed under direct orders to patrol the ruined districts and enforce order, were deployed throughout the city within days of the disaster, a level of military presence in the capital that would have been unusual under ordinary peacetime conditions, but was treated, given the scale of the emergency, as a necessary measure rather than an extraordinary one. Checkpoints were established at key points along the roads leading into the city, intended both to control the movement of potential looters entering Lisbon and to manage the flow of displaced residents, leaving it a dual function that placed a considerable administrative burden on troops more accustomed to conventional military duties than to civil policing on this scale. Officers were given considerable latitude to make judgment calls in the field, since no detailed rulebook existed for a situation this unprecedented, which meant that the practical experience of martial law in Lisbon in November of 1755 varied somewhat from district to district depending on the individual commanders responsible for each area. The severity of this response reflected a calculation that a city already devastated by natural disaster could not additionally absorb a breakdown into lawlessness, and that visible, immediate consequences for looting would deter the kind of opportunistic crime that might otherwise have compounded the disaster's toll on survivors trying to recover what remained of their property. Alongside the punitive measures, Carvalho and Melo moved quickly to address the practical problem of feeding a population that had, in a matter of hours, lost access to much of its normal food supply. Bakeries destroyed in the fire, warehouses of stored grain lost to the same flames, and a disrupted transportation network all threatened the city with the prospect of famine layered on top of every other disaster it had already suffered. Fixed prices were imposed on bread and other essential goods, a measure intended to prevent merchants who still had stock from exploiting the crisis by charging prices desperate survivors could not afford, and hoarding was treated as a serious offense subject to punishment alongside looting. Merchants found withholding stock in anticipation of higher prices faced confiscation of their goods, and, in more severe cases, the same category of punishment applied to looters, a policy that placed the administration's practical need to maintain a stable food supply above the ordinary commercial interests of the merchant class, a class that under normal circumstances held considerable influence within Portuguese economic life. Some merchants, particularly among the foreign trading community, whose warehouses had survived largely intact outside the districts hit hardest by the fire, cooperated with the price controls as a matter of practical necessity, recognizing that a city descending into famine offered a far worse commercial environment than one operating under temporary fixed prices. Grain was requisitioned from the surrounding countryside and, where necessary, purchased from foreign sources and shipped into the city to supplement what remained of Lisbon's own stores, an operation that required coordinating shipping, storage, and distribution at a moment when the institutions that would ordinarily have managed such logistics were themselves in ruins. Neighboring agricultural regions were ordered to direct a portion of their harvest toward Lisbon rather than to their usual markets, a redirection of supply that eased the capital's immediate crisis but placed strain on smaller towns and rural communities that had their own, if less severe, needs to manage in the aftermath of an earthquake that had been felt, in diminishing intensity, across much of the country. Distribution points were established at several locations throughout the city where survivors could obtain rationed bread and other essential supplies, a system that required constant management to prevent the kind of disorder and hoarding the fixed pricing measures had already been designed to discourage. Carvalho and Melo also moved to address the housing crisis created by the destruction of a majority of the city's buildings, authorizing the construction of temporary wooden shelters in open areas of the city and its surroundings, a stopgap measure intended to give displaced residents some form of shelter while longer-term reconstruction was planned. The scale of displacement made this an urgent priority in its own right, since a population numbering in the tens of thousands now had no permanent roof over their heads as the Portuguese winter approached. A seasonal pressure layered on top of every other burden the disaster had already imposed on the city's survivors. These temporary structures, erected quickly and without much regard for permanence, would in some cases remain in use for a considerable stretch of time, since the scale of destruction meant that permanent rebuilding could not proceed quickly enough to house the entire displaced population in the short term. The wooden shelters, arranged in makeshift encampments across open ground on the city's outskirts, lacked the sanitation infrastructure a more permanent settlement would have required, and officials overseeing the recovery grew concerned in the weeks following the disaster about the risk of disease spreading through these densely packed temporary communities, a concern that added urgency to the broader push toward permanent reconstruction. Reports from the period describe conditions in these encampments as difficult but functional, with basic order maintained largely through the same combination of military presence and administrative rationing that governed the rest of the emergency response across the city. Beyond these immediate measures, Carvalho y Melo undertook an action that would prove significant for reasons that had little to do with the emergency response itself. In the weeks following the disaster, he directed that a detailed questionnaire be sent to parish priests and civil authorities across Portugal, asking a standardized set of questions about how the earthquake had been experienced in their region. The questions covered matters including the time the shaking had begun, its duration, the extent of structural damage, whether a tsunami had been observed along the coast, whether animals had shown unusual behavior beforehand, and how many aftershocks had been felt in the days that followed. Parish priests, as the most consistently literate and locally present authority figures across rural Portugal, were well positioned to gather this kind of information systematically, and the questionnaires' design reflected an implicit recognition that useful data about a disaster of this scale could not be gathered from the capital alone, but needed to be assembled from observations recorded across the entire kingdom. The responses that survive today, held in Portuguese archives, provide modern researchers with an unusually detailed regional picture of how a single earthquake was experienced across a wide geographic area, a resource that has allowed later seismologists to reconstruct patterns of intensity and timing that would otherwise have been lost entirely to the passage of time. This survey, distributed to parishes throughout the kingdom and, by some accounts, to Portuguese territories overseas as well, represented an unusually systematic attempt to gather empirical data about a natural disaster at a time when no established scientific method for doing so yet existed anywhere in Europe. No comparable government-directed data collection effort following a natural disaster appears to have been undertaken anywhere else in Europe at this point in the 18th century, which is part of why the Portuguese response to 1755, despite emerging from an emergency measure rather than any prior scientific ambition, is treated by historians of science as a genuine turning point rather than an isolated curiosity. The responses, though intended at the time primarily as an administrative tool for understanding the scale of the damage across the kingdom, would later be recognized as one of the earliest examples of systematic seismological data collection in European history, a detail whose full significance would not become clear for generations. Not everyone in Lisbon's religious establishment viewed Carvalho y Melo's methodical, administrative approach to the disaster favorably. A significant faction within the Portuguese clergy, most prominently associated with the Jesuit priest Gabriel Malagrida, argued publicly that the earthquake represented divine punishment for the moral failings of Lisbon's population, and that the appropriate response was penance, prayer, and religious reflection, rather than the practical, secular measures Carvalho y Melo had implemented. This position found a receptive audience among a population that had just lived through a catastrophe of biblical proportions on one of the holiest days of the religious calendar, a coincidence of timing that made theological explanations feel, to many survivors, more immediately intuitive than any administrative account of tectonic plates and ocean waves could have. This theological interpretation was not a fringe position. It reflected a mainstream strand of contemporary religious thought, consistent with how earthquakes and other natural disasters had traditionally been explained within Catholic theology for centuries before 1755. Malagrida, an Italian-born Jesuit who had spent years as a missionary in Brazil before returning to Portugal, held considerable influence within court circles, including a close relationship with members of the royal family, which gave his public criticism of the secular recovery effort a reach and credibility that a less prominent clergyman's objections would not have carried. His writings on the disaster, circulated in the months following the earthquake, argued explicitly that Lisbon's sins had brought divine judgment upon the city, and that Carvalho y Melo's administrative approach to the crisis, treating a punishment from God as a matter of logistics and public order, compounded rather than addressed the underlying spiritual failure the earthquake represented. Carvalho y Melo's approach, treating the disaster as a logistical and administrative problem to be managed through concrete measures rather than a moral event requiring religious atonement, put him in direct tension with this faction of the clergy from the earliest days of the crisis, a tension that would deepen considerably over the following years and eventually produce consequences neither side could have anticipated in November of 1755. That conflict between a secular administrative model of governance and a religious establishment accustomed to significant influence over public life would shape Portuguese politics well beyond the immediate crisis of the earthquake's aftermath, extending into questions of press censorship, the role of religious orders within the kingdom, and ultimately the position of the Jesuit order within Portugal itself. Within a decade of the earthquake, that tension would culminate in the expulsion of the Jesuit order from Portugal and its overseas territories entirely, a dramatic escalation whose roots can be traced directly back to the disagreement between Carvalho y Melo and clergy like Malagrida over how the disaster itself should be understood and addressed. Malagrida's own fate would prove considerably more severe than exile. Years later, following a period of imprisonment on charges connected to a separate plot against the king, he was tried by the Portuguese Inquisition and executed, an outcome that later historians have consistently linked back to the animosity that first crystallized between him and Carvalho y Melo in the disputes over the earthquake's meaning and the proper response to it. For the moment, in the weeks immediately following November 1st, that larger political conflict remains secondary to the practical work of stabilizing a devastated capital, burying the dead, feeding the living, controlling looting, and beginning to assess just how completely the city would need to be rebuilt. By the closing weeks of 1755, with the fires extinguished and the dead largely disposed of, a fragile order had returned to the ruined streets, though the scale of what still lay ahead was only beginning to come into focus for the people directing the recovery. Aftershocks had grown less frequent by this point, though they had not stopped entirely, and the makeshift camps spreading across the edges of the city held survivors still unwilling to trust any roof over their heads. Lisbon could not simply be repaired in the way a damaged building might be patched and reoccupied. Large sections of the city center had been reduced to little more than open ground, cleared by fire of the debris the earthquake itself had created, presenting both an enormous logistical challenge and an unusual opportunity that few European capitals of the period would ever have. Property owners returning to the Baixia in the weeks after the fire found streets they could no longer clearly trace, boundary markers destroyed along with the deeds that had once recorded them, and, in place of the crowded, unplanned district that had stood there for centuries, something closer to a blank slate than any Portuguese official had encountered before within the heart of the capital. That blank slate, however devastating its cause, offered Carvalho e Melo and the engineers he would soon assemble a possibility no gradual process of urban renewal could ever have provided: the chance to design an entire district from its foundations upward, incorporating lessons about survivability that the disaster itself had just taught in the most severe terms possible. No European capital of the period had faced a comparable moment, a sudden, near-total clearing of its historic commercial core, paired with a government already accustomed, through weeks of crisis management, to acting decisively and without deference to the customary pace of institutional change. That opportunity to rebuild not merely what had existed before, but a version of the city designed specifically to survive whatever might come next, would define the next phase of the disaster's long aftermath, and it would fall to the same minister who had organized the burial of the dead and the feeding of the living to decide what kind of city would rise from the cleared ground of the old one. Whatever authority Carvalho e Melo had assembled through improvisation and necessity in the weeks after November 1st, he was now prepared to apply to a task with no real precedent in Portuguese history, not merely repairing a damaged capital, but designing, block by block, a new one. The scale of the task ahead was becoming clear to everyone directing the recovery even before the last embers had fully died down across the ruined city. Aftershocks continued intermittently through those closing weeks of 1755, though with diminishing frequency, and the temporary encampments across the city's outskirts held a population still uncertain whether the ground beneath them could be trusted at all. The question facing Carvalho e Melo was no longer how to manage an emergency, but how to rebuild a capital city in a way that acknowledged, for the first time in Portuguese history, that the ground itself could not be assumed safe. That acknowledgement represented a genuine departure from centuries of assumption embedded in how Lisbon, and indeed most European cities, had always been built, an assumption that treated the ground as a fixed, reliable foundation, rather than a variable the city's own survival now depended on actively managing. He turned to Manuel de Maia, the kingdom's chief military engineer, and a man already close to 80 years old by 1755, to lead the technical planning for reconstruction. De Maia's advanced age did nothing to slow the pace of his work in the months following the disaster, and his formal proposals to the Crown, produced within a remarkably short window given the scale of what they addressed, reflected a career's worth of accumulated engineering judgment, brought to bear on a problem no engineer in Portuguese history had faced before at this scale. De Maia's long career had given him extensive experience with fortification design and military engineering, a background that, while not originally intended for civilian urban planning, proved directly relevant to the problem of designing structures capable of withstanding sudden, violent force. He had spent decades studying defensive works across Portugal and its territories, structures built specifically to absorb the impact of cannon fire and siege. And while an earthquake bore no resemblance to an artillery bombardment in its cause, the underlying engineering question, how to design a structure that could absorb violent force without total structural failure, drew on exactly the kind of expertise his military career had developed. In the weeks following the disaster, De Maia produced a set of formal proposals outlining several possible approaches to rebuilding the ruined city center, ranging from the most conservative option, simply reconstructing the Baixa on its original medieval street plan, to the most radical, abandoning the old site entirely and relocating the commercial heart of the city elsewhere. Between these extremes sat a middle option, clearing the ruins of the Baixa completely and rebuilding the district according to an entirely new, regular plan. Wider streets, uniform building heights, and construction methods designed specifically to resist future earthquakes. De Maia's formal proposal to the Crown laid out the practical reasoning behind each option with considerable care, weighing the cost and disruption of a full redesign against the ongoing risk of rebuilding on the old, disaster-prone footprint without any structural changes at all. Carvalho y Melo, with the king's approval, chose this middle path, rejecting both the sentimental attachment to rebuilding exactly what had been lost and the impractical expense of abandoning the city's historic commercial center altogether. The engineers assigned to turn this decision into an actual design, most prominently Eugenio dos Santos and the Hungarian-born engineer Carlos Mardel, faced a task with almost no direct precedent anywhere in Europe, designing not merely individual buildings, but an entire urban district engineered from the ground up to survive a repeat of the disaster that had just destroyed its predecessor. Their design divided the rebuilt Baixa into a regular grid of streets, a stark departure from the tangled, organically grown lanes that had defined the district for centuries before 1755. The grid ran roughly parallel and perpendicular between two central squares, the Rocio to the north and the Terreiro do Passo, the same waterfront plaza that had drawn thousands of survivors seeking safety on the day of the disaster, now rebuilt and renamed the Praça do Comércio, to the south along the river. Long, straight avenues connected these two anchor points, a layout that stood in deliberate contrast to the maze-like unpredictability of the pre-disaster city, and one that gave both pedestrians and, in a future emergency, evacuation efforts a clear and navigable path through the district. Streets were widened considerably beyond their previous dimensions, a change driven by two separate but related concerns: preventing the kind of fire spread that had consumed so much of the city in the days after the earthquake, and ensuring that in the event of another major tremor, falling debris from collapsing buildings would not block the only paths available for evacuation or emergency response. Building heights were standardized across the district as well, with uniform facades that gave the rebuilt Baixa a consistency of appearance distinct from the more organic, individually developed streetscape that had characterized the city before the disaster. Most buildings along the main commercial streets were restricted to a consistent number of stories, typically 4 above the ground floor, a limit that served both an aesthetic purpose in creating a unified streetscape and a structural one in preventing the kind of excessive, unregulated vertical expansion that had made many pre-disaster buildings so vulnerable to collapse. Decorative elements were similarly standardized and simplified, compared to the elaborate, individually commissioned facades common before 1755, a shift that reflected both the practical urgency of rebuilding quickly and a broader philosophical departure from the ornamental extravagance that had characterized so much of Lisbon's pre-disaster architecture, particularly its churches. This standardization was not merely aesthetic. Consistent building heights and shared party walls, engineered as part of an integrated structural system rather than added piecemeal over generations, distributed the load of an earthquake's lateral forces more evenly across a connected row of buildings than the mismatched construction of the old city ever could have. The most significant technical innovation to emerge from this reconstruction effort, and the one that would eventually earn Lisbon's rebuilt downtown a place in the history of structural engineering, was a timber framing system now known as the gaiola pombalina, or pombaline cage. The gaiola consisted of an interlocking lattice of timber beams embedded within a building's walls, forming a flexible internal skeleton that ran through the masonry and connected floor to floor throughout the structure. Unlike a conventional stone or brick wall, which resists force by sheer mass and rigidity until it cracks and fails, the timber lattice of the gaiola pombalina was designed to flex under lateral stress, absorbing and redistributing the kind of side-to-side motion an earthquake produces, rather than simply resisting it until the material gave way. The wooden framework was typically arranged in a diagonal cross-bracing pattern within each wall section, a geometry that gave the structure resistance to force applied from multiple directions rather than just one, since an earthquake's shaking does not move a building in a single, predictable line. This diagonal bracing, forming a series of interlocking triangular shapes throughout the wall's internal structure, distributed stress across the entire lattice rather than concentrating it at any single joint, a structural principle that modern engineers recognize as fundamental to seismic-resistant design, even though the term itself and the mathematical models used to formalize it would not exist for generations after Lisbon's carpenters first began assembling these frames by hand. Carpenters constructing the gaiola framework worked largely from practical experience and iterative refinement, rather than any formal theoretical calculation, since the mathematics of structural engineering as a distinct scientific discipline had not yet developed to the point where such calculations were possible, which makes the resulting design's effectiveness a notable achievement of applied craftsmanship rather than abstract theory. Masonry infill was then packed around and between the timber lattice, giving the completed wall its solid appearance and providing the fire resistance and weather protection that a purely wooden structure could not offer on its own. From the street, a completed pombaline building looked, to most observers, largely indistinguishable from conventional masonry construction elsewhere in Europe. Its innovative timber skeleton concealed entirely within walls that presented the same solid, plastered facade common to buildings across the continent. That concealment meant the gaiola pombalina's significance went largely unrecognized outside a small circle of engineers and builders for generations, its innovations hidden behind ordinary-looking walls, in a way that limited how quickly or widely the technique's underlying principles might otherwise have spread to other earthquake-prone regions of Europe. The result was a hybrid construction method that combined the flexibility of timber framing with the durability and fire resistance of masonry, a combination that anticipated by roughly 2 centuries engineering principles that would not be formally understood and codified until the development of modern seismic design standards in the 20th century. According to accounts describing the testing process used to evaluate this new construction method, model buildings incorporating the Gaiola design were subjected to a practical stress test before the technique was approved for use throughout the rebuilt district. Soldiers were marched in formation around and, in some versions of the account, upon the models, their coordinated footsteps generating a rhythmic vibration intended to simulate the shaking of an earthquake. Whether this specific testing method was applied exactly as later accounts describe it, or represents some degree of simplification and embellishment introduced as the story was retold over the following generations, the underlying fact it reflects is not in dispute. Portuguese engineers in the years immediately following 1755 conducted deliberate practical experimentation to evaluate how their new building method would perform under simulated seismic stress, a systematic approach to structural testing that had few, if any, parallels elsewhere in contemporary European construction practice. This willingness to test, rather than simply assume, to treat a building method as a hypothesis requiring some form of practical verification before widespread adoption, distinguishes the Pombaline reconstruction from most contemporary European rebuilding efforts, which typically relied on established custom and inherited craft knowledge rather than any deliberate process of experimental evaluation. The specific instruments and formal methodology available to Portuguese engineers in the 1750s were, by modern standards, extremely limited, and the marching soldier test, whatever its precise historical accuracy, should be understood as a product of that limitation, an ingenious but necessarily crude approximation of the kind of controlled structural testing that would not become formally standardized in engineering practice until the following century. Buildings constructed using the Gaiola Pombalina method also incorporated other features specifically intended to reduce earthquake risk. Chimneys and other tall, narrow projections, elements that had proven particularly prone to collapse during the 1755 earthquake, were redesigned to be shorter and more securely anchored to the main structure of each building. Bell towers and other tall decorative elements, so devastating in their collapse during the original earthquake, were either eliminated from the new design entirely or reduced significantly in height and mass, a direct and visible departure from the architectural priorities that had shaped Lisbon's skyline before the disaster. Party walls between adjoining buildings were constructed taller than the roofline itself, a specific measure intended to prevent fire from spreading directly from one structure's roof to its neighbors, a direct engineering response to the specific mechanism by which the 1755 fire had jumped from building to building across the ruined city. These raised party walls, sometimes referred to by later architectural historians as fire-break walls, represented one of the clearest examples in the entire reconstruction of a design feature drawn directly from the specific, documented failure mode of a single historical disaster, rather than from any general theory of urban fire prevention that might have applied equally to any city. Roof structures throughout the district were also reconsidered, with an emphasis on materials and configurations less prone to the kind of rapid, uncontrolled ignition that had allowed the 1755 fire to spread so quickly across the tightly packed rooftops of the old Bacha. Ground floor commercial spaces throughout the rebuilt Bacha were designed with covered arcades, providing pedestrians with some measure of shelter from falling debris in the event of a future earthquake, a design consideration that had no equivalent in the pre-1755 city. These arcaded walkways also served an ordinary commercial purpose entirely apart from their safety function, sheltering shoppers and merchants from rain and sun, in a manner consistent with arcade designs already common in other major European commercial centers, a detail that illustrates how the reconstruction managed to serve practical daily use and disaster resilience within the same architectural feature. Financing a reconstruction project of this scale placed considerable strain on Portuguese royal finances, already stretched thin by decades of ambitious building projects under João V and by the general costs of running a global empire. A new tax was introduced specifically to fund the rebuilding effort, levied on goods, including certain colonial imports arriving through the very trade networks that had made Lisbon wealthy enough to build such an elaborate capital in the first place. Wine exports, a significant category of Portuguese trade, particularly with England, were among the goods subject to this new levy, a choice that connected the physical reconstruction of the capital directly to the ongoing commercial relationships that defined so much of Portugal's economic position in 18th century Europe. The revenue generated proved substantial enough to sustain a reconstruction effort spanning decades, though it never fully matched the scale of expenditure the project ultimately required, meaning that private capital, invested by merchants and property owners eager to reclaim their position in the rebuilt commercial district, supplemented the Crown's own financial commitment throughout the reconstruction period. This funding mechanism tied the reconstruction directly to the continued flow of colonial trade, meaning that the same Brazilian wealth that had financed the ornate, earthquake-vulnerable churches of the pre-1755 city was now redirected toward financing a fundamentally different kind of urban development, one prioritizing structural resilience over religious ornamentation. That shift in priorities, from a capital built to display wealth through religious grandeur, to one built to survive the specific hazard that had nearly destroyed it, reflected a broader change in outlook that Carvalho e Melo brought to Portuguese governance more generally during his years in power, one that placed practical, verifiable results above ceremonial display, wherever the two came into conflict. Construction of the new Baixa proceeded over a period of decades rather than years, with the most visible core of the district substantially complete by the 1770s, though refinements and expansions continued well beyond that point as resources allowed and as the practical lessons of early construction phases informed later ones. Labor for the project drew on a considerable workforce, including skilled carpenters trained specifically in the Gaiola construction method, masons familiar with the standardized building techniques the new design required, and laborers engaged in the ongoing work of clearing remaining rubble from sections of the district not yet reached by earlier phases of construction. The pace of reconstruction inevitably varied, depending on available funding, weather conditions, and the practical challenges of coordinating a project of this scale across a workforce numbering in the thousands, and several contemporary accounts note periods of frustration among displaced property owners whose plots remained undeveloped years after the disaster, while other sections of the district visibly progressed. Property owners whose buildings had stood in the district before the disaster were, in principle, entitled to reclaim plots roughly corresponding to their previous holdings, though the new regular grid meant that exact boundaries rarely matched the old ones precisely, requiring negotiation and adjustment that added further delay and occasional dispute to an already complicated process. Compensation and plot allocation were managed through a dedicated administrative body established specifically for this purpose, a further example of the kind of formal, centralized bureaucratic response that had characterized Carvalho e Melo's handling of the disaster from its earliest hours, extended now into the considerably longer and more complex task of urban reconstruction. Disputes that could not be resolved through this administrative process were occasionally referred to more formal legal proceedings, though the volume of competing claims arising from a disaster that had destroyed so many of the original property records meant that some boundary questions were still being settled years after construction on the surrounding buildings had already begun. The families and merchants displaced by the disaster, many of whom had spent years in the temporary encampments established in the immediate aftermath, gradually returned to a district that would have been, in its layout, its building heights, and its underlying construction, almost unrecognizable to anyone who had known the Baixia as it existed on the morning of October 31st, 1755. For those who had lived through the disaster as children and returned decades later as the reconstruction neared completion, the rebuilt district represented not a restoration of what they remembered, but an entirely new place built atop the same ground, carrying the same name and occupying the same position within the city, yet bearing almost no physical resemblance to the crowded, unplanned neighborhood their families had once called home. What emerged from this reconstruction was not merely a rebuilt commercial district, but arguably the first large-scale example in European history of a city center deliberately engineered as a coordinated whole to survive a specific and previously demonstrated natural hazard. Earlier European cities had rebuilt after fires and other disasters, sometimes incorporating modest improvements in fire prevention or street width, but no prior European reconstruction effort had approached the challenge with the systematic, empirically informed methodology Carvalho e Melo's engineers applied to the Baixia, testing construction techniques under simulated stress, standardizing design across an entire district, and treating the underlying hazard, in this case seismic risk, as a defined engineering problem to be solved through deliberate design choices rather than simply hoped against through faith or fortune. Later architectural and engineering historians examining the Pombaline reconstruction have generally treated it as an early and unusually coherent example of what would eventually be recognized as performance-based design, an approach to construction that begins not with tradition or ornament as its primary consideration, but with a specific, defined threat the resulting structure must be capable of surviving. That framing structure as a direct response to a known and previously demonstrated hazard would not become a widespread, formally articulated principle of engineering practice until long after the last of Pombal's original builders had died, but its early and largely successful application in 18th century Lisbon stands as one of the more significant, if historically under-recognized, achievements to emerge from the entire 18th century in the field of structural design. The rebuilt district would come to bear Carvalho e Melo's own eventual title, granted to him by the king in recognition of his role in the kingdom's recovery and ongoing governance. In 1769, he was named Marquis de Pombal, and it is by that title, the Marquis of Pombal, that history has generally remembered him, and by which the architectural style of the rebuilt downtown, Pombaline architecture, and its distinctive anti-seismic framing system, the Gaiola Pombalina, carry his name into the present. The title itself referred to a small town some distance from Lisbon, unrelated to the earthquake or the reconstruction in any direct geographic sense, yet it would become, through the association history attached to it, permanently linked to the specific achievement of rebuilding a devastated European capital, according to deliberately engineered anti-seismic principles. That name, and the engineering method it now describes, would prove to be one of the more durable legacies to emerge from a single catastrophic morning in November of 1755. Though its full significance and the broader intellectual and institutional aftermath the disaster set in motion far beyond the streets of Lisbon itself would take considerably longer than the reconstruction of the Baixa to fully unfold. That aftermath reached well past the streets of Lisbon, into the studies and correspondence of philosophers who had never once set foot in Portugal. That wider unfolding reached philosophers who never set foot in Portugal, and eventually gave rise to an entire scientific discipline devoted to understanding the ground itself. News of the Lisbon earthquake reached the rest of Europe within weeks, carried by the same merchant correspondence and diplomatic channels that had long connected the city to London, Paris, and beyond, and the scale of the disaster it described struck European intellectual circles with particular force. The disaster arrived, for most European readers, not as a single dramatic account, but as a gradually accumulating body of correspondence, official reports, and second-hand retellings, each new letter adding further detail to a picture that grew more staggering the more completely it came into focus. Among those most affected was the French writer and philosopher François-Marie Arouet, known to history by his pen name Voltaire, who had spent much of his career engaging with the philosophical optimism popularized by the German philosopher Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, a worldview holding that the universe, as created by a benevolent and rational God, necessarily represented the best of all possible arrangements, in which every apparent evil served some greater, ultimately justified purpose. Voltaire had already expressed skepticism toward this optimistic framework before 1755, but the Lisbon disaster, striking a devout Catholic city on one of its holiest days, killing worshippers gathered specifically to honor their faith, gave him a concrete and devastating example against which to test the philosophy directly. The disaster's particular characteristics made it an unusually potent test case for this philosophical debate. It had struck without any of the human triggers, war, negligence, or obvious moral failing that might otherwise have offered a straightforward explanation, and its victims included children, clergy, and ordinary worshippers engaged in nothing more provocative than attending a religious service on a designated holy day. For a philosophical framework built on the premise that every apparent evil ultimately served some greater good, the Lisbon earthquake presented a case difficult to reconcile through the ordinary arguments that had satisfied earlier generations of religious and philosophical thinkers confronting smaller-scale suffering. He composed a lengthy poem in response, questioning how a benevolent and rational divine order could permit the deaths of thousands of people engaged in nothing more than the ordinary practice of their religion on a morning that offered no warning and no opportunity for the kind of moral failing that theological explanations like Milagrius sought to attribute to the victims. The poem circulated widely across intellectual circles in France and beyond, provoking direct responses from other philosophers, including an extended exchange of ideas with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who argued in reply that the disaster's severity owed as much to human choices, building tall, densely packed cities in a known seismic region, as to any question of divine justice, an argument that anticipated, in its basic structure, the modern understanding that a disaster's human toll reflects decisions about construction and urban planning as much as the underlying natural hazard itself. Rousseau's specific point, that residents of Lisbon had chosen to live in six-story buildings packed closely together rather than more dispersed, single-story dwellings, and that this choice, not divine judgment, explained much of the disaster's severity, represented one of the earliest clear articulations of a distinction modern disaster researchers still draw between a natural hazard, the earthquake itself, and a disaster, the human and structural toll that results from how a society has chosen to build and organize itself in the face of that hazard. The exchange between Voltaire and Rousseau, conducted through published letters and essays circulated among European intellectual circles over the following months, extended the Lisbon earthquake's influence well beyond questions of theology into an early and surprisingly modern discussion of urban planning, risk, and the degree to which human decisions shape the consequences of natural events. Voltaire's engagement with the disaster did not end with the poem. The philosophical questions it raised fed directly into his best-known work, a satirical novel that used the aftermath of a fictionalized earthquake as one of its central episodes to lampoon unquestioning philosophical optimism, cementing the 1755 disaster's place in European intellectual history well beyond the specific circles of natural philosophy or theology. That novel's continued place in school curricula and literary study across the world today means that generations of readers who have never studied the earthquake itself as a historical event have nonetheless encountered its philosophical shadow, absorbed secondhand through a work of fiction whose central provocation originated directly in the ruins of a single Portuguese morning. The disaster's influence extended into the work of philosophers, concerned less with theology and more with the physical mechanics of the earthquake itself, among them the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, then in the early stages of his career at the University of Königsberg. Kant, drawing on the fragmentary reports of the disaster's physical effects that had reached German intellectual circles by early 1756, published a series of essays specifically addressing the physical causes of earthquakes, proposing theories about underground cavities, gases, and the transmission of shock through the Earth's structure. Kant's proposed mechanisms have not survived the subsequent 2.5 centuries of geological research intact, since the modern understanding of plate tectonics did not exist in any form during his lifetime, and would not be developed until the 20th century. But the essays themselves are widely regarded by historians of science as significant for their underlying approach, rather than their specific conclusions. Kant proposed, among other ideas, that vast underground caverns filled with combustible materials and gases might ignite and produce the kind of violent shaking that had been reported from Lisbon, a theory that reflected the best available geological thinking of the period, even though it bears little resemblance to modern plate tectonic theory. What distinguished Kant's essays from centuries of prior earthquake commentary was not the accuracy of his specific mechanism, but his insistence that the phenomenon could and should be explained through natural causes accessible to careful observation and reasoned argument, rather than left as a matter of theological mystery or divine intention beyond human inquiry. Rather than attributing the earthquake to divine will or moral judgment, Kant treated it as a natural phenomenon subject to physical laws that could, in principle, be studied, described, and eventually understood through careful observation and reasoned inquiry, a framework that represents one of the identifiable starting points for what would later become the scientific discipline of seismology. This shift in framework, treating earthquakes as natural events governed by physical processes rather than as expressions of moral or theological significance, did not happen instantly or uniformly across Europe following the 1755 disaster, and religious interpretations, including the position articulated by Melo in Lisbon itself, continued to hold significant cultural influence for years afterward. The two frameworks, theological and empirical, coexisted uneasily in European thought for decades following the disaster, with individual thinkers, and in some cases the same thinker at different points in their career, moving between explanations rooted in divine judgment and explanations rooted in physical process, depending on the specific question at hand and the audience being addressed. But the intellectual momentum among natural philosophers had shifted decisively enough that the Lisbon earthquake is now regularly cited by historians of science as a pivotal moment in the broader transition, unfolding gradually across the 18th century toward treating natural disasters as objects of empirical scientific study, rather than primarily as occasions for theological reflection. The systematic data collection effort Carvalho e Melo had ordered in the immediate aftermath of the disaster, the questionnaire distributed to parishes throughout Portugal, asking standardized questions about the timing, duration, and physical effects of the shaking, fed directly into this same intellectual shift, providing exactly the kind of empirical, comparable observations that a more scientific approach to understanding earthquakes would require. Later scholars examining the responses gathered through that survey have credited it as one of the earliest systematic attempts anywhere in the world to collect standardized data about a natural disaster across a wide geographic area, a methodology that anticipated, by more than a century, the kind of coordinated data collection that would eventually become standard practice in the formal scientific study of earthquakes. The specific structure of Carvalho e Melo's questionnaire, asking uniform, comparable questions across every parish rather than simply gathering unstructured narrative accounts, distinguishes it from earlier, more anecdotal responses to natural disasters recorded elsewhere in European history, and this structural uniformity is precisely what allows modern researchers to treat the responses as genuine data rather than merely as a collection of individual stories. Contemporary earthquake researchers, including seismologists working directly with historical records, have returned to these 18th century parish responses repeatedly over the past century, using the geographic pattern of reported intensity across Portugal to help reconstruct the earthquake's epicenter and magnitude with far greater precision than would be possible from Lisbon's own severely damaged records alone. The word seismology itself would not enter scientific vocabulary until the 19th century, and the first true seismograph, an instrument capable of mechanically recording ground motion with precision, would not be developed until decades after that. But the conceptual foundation, the idea that an earthquake was a natural phenomenon that could be studied systematically through comparable data gathered across a wide area, traces a clear and direct line back to the Portuguese government's response to the events of November 1st, 1755. Historians of science, tracing the discipline's origins, commonly point to this combination: Kant's insistence on natural rather than theological causation, paired with Pombal's practical, government-organized data collection, as the twin roots from which a recognizably modern approach to studying earthquakes would eventually grow, even though neither man used the word seismology, and neither could have foreseen the specific instruments and institutions the field would eventually develop. The gaiola pombalina construction technique, developed in Lisbon's reconstruction, similarly anticipated principles that would not become formalized within mainstream engineering practice for generations. Modern seismic engineering, particularly the concept of designing structures with flexible, energy-absorbing frameworks rather than relying solely on rigid strength to resist lateral force, rests on principles that Lisbon's 18th century carpenters and engineers had already discovered through practical experimentation, embedding timber lattices within their masonry walls more than 200 years before structural engineers would develop the mathematical models to formally explain why the technique worked as well as it did. Contemporary building codes in earthquake-prone regions around the world, from California to Japan to Chile, now incorporate formal requirements for exactly this kind of flexible, energy-dissipating structural design, a principle that traces its earliest large-scale, deliberately engineered application directly back to the streets of Pombaline, Lisbon. Modern engineers refer to this general design philosophy using terms unavailable to Lisbon's 18th century builders: base isolation, ductile framing, seismic damping, but the underlying physical insight that a structure surviving violent ground motion needs some capacity to flex and absorb energy, rather than relying purely on rigid strength, remains fundamentally the same principle the Gaiola Pombalina embodied through empirical trial rather than mathematical derivation. Engineering historians who have studied the Gaiola Pombalina in detail have noted that its combination of flexible internal framing with a durable, fire-resistant exterior anticipates, in broad conceptual terms, design strategies that would not reappear in comparable form until the reinforced concrete and steel frame seismic engineering that emerged in Japan and California during the 20th century, following those regions' own catastrophic earthquake experiences. The administrative model, Carvalho e Melo, improvised in the days and weeks following the disaster, centralized government coordination of burial, food distribution, public order, and reconstruction planning in the immediate aftermath of a catastrophic natural disaster, also established a template that would echo through the following centuries of European governance. Prior to 1755, no clear precedent existed within most European governments for how a state should organize its response to a natural catastrophe of overwhelming scale, and the ad hoc, improvised nature of Portugal's response, however imperfect in its specific execution, demonstrated that a centralized, empowered civil authority could meaningfully shape the outcome of a disaster's aftermath, reducing suffering, restoring order, and enabling recovery, in ways that a purely local or ecclesiastical response could not achieve on its own. Other European governments took note of Portugal's approach in the years that followed, and while no single disaster response in the remainder of the 18th century replicated the scale of Lisbon's crisis, the general principle that a natural catastrophe called for organized, centralized state intervention rather than being left primarily to local communities, charitable religious institutions, or simple chance gradually became more widely accepted across European governance over the following decades. Modern disaster response agencies, operating today in countries around the world, coordinate exactly this combination of functions: emergency shelter, food distribution, public order, and long-term reconstruction planning under centralized government authority, a governance model whose earliest large-scale demonstration in European history traces back to the improvised authority Carvalho e Melo, assembled in the ruins of Lisbon in November of 1755. The specific administrative tools Carvalho e Melo employed: price controls on essential goods, requisitioned grain distribution, military-enforced public order, and government-directed burial operations remain recognizable components of disaster response frameworks used by national governments today, even though the surrounding legal and institutional context has grown vastly more elaborate in the intervening centuries. International organizations coordinating disaster relief in the 21st century operate according to principles that would not have been unfamiliar to Carvalho y Melo. That effective response requires centralized coordinations, rapid decision-making authority, unencumbered by ordinary bureaucratic process, and a willingness to prioritize immediate practical survival needs above longer-term considerations of property, custom, or ceremony. The insurance industry, too, carries a thread connecting back to this same disaster, though less directly than the engineering and governance legacies already discussed. The financial devastation wrought by the earthquake, tsunami, and fire, striking merchants, property owners, and trading houses across the city simultaneously and without warning, illustrated with stark clarity the value of financial instruments capable of distributing catastrophic risk across a broader pool of participants, rather than leaving individual property owners to absorb total, unpredictable losses entirely on their own. While formal fire and property insurance had already existed in various forms in cities like London before 1755, the scale of the Lisbon disaster and the widely circulated accounts of merchants and trading houses financially ruined overnight by a catastrophe entirely outside their control contributed to a broader European conversation about risk, catastrophic loss, and the financial mechanisms available to manage them, a conversation that would continue to develop over the following century as the modern insurance industry gradually took shape. Marine and fire insurance markets operating in London and other major European commercial centers took note of the Lisbon disasters specifically for what it demonstrated about correlated risk, the danger that a single catastrophic event could destroy an entire concentration of insured property simultaneously. A lesson that would inform how insurers thought about spreading and pricing risk across broader geographic areas in the decades that followed. Underwriters accustomed to pricing risk against isolated building fires or individual shipwrecks now had a concrete example of what happened when an entire city's commercial wealth was exposed to a single event capable of destroying warehouses, ships, and trading houses across an entire waterfront within the same few hours. That lesson, learned in part from watching an entire commercial district and its associated wealth destroyed within the span of a single day, contributed over time to the development of more sophisticated approaches to catastrophic risk pooling, approaches that underpin the modern reinsurance industry's practice of spreading exposure to major disasters across markets and institutions spanning the globe, precisely so that no single earthquake, however severe, can concentrate its financial consequences on any one insurer or region. Today, the district Carvalho y Melo's engineers designed in the years following the disaster still stands at the heart of Lisbon. Its regular grid of streets, its uniform facades, and its underlying timber lattice construction largely intact after more than 2.5 centuries, having survived, among other tests, a moderate earthquake in 1969, with considerably less damage than the surrounding, more modern construction in other parts of the city. That 1969 earthquake, centered off the same general stretch of Atlantic coastline that had produced the 1755 disaster, offered an unplanned but genuinely significant test of the Pombaline construction method after more than 200 years and the comparatively minor damage sustained by the old gaiola-framed buildings relative to newer structures built without the same anti-seismic principles. provided modern engineers with real-world confirmation of what the 18th century marching soldier tests had only approximated. Structural surveys conducted in the Baisha following that later earthquake documented specific cases where Pombaline buildings, standing directly alongside more modern, unreinforced construction, showed markedly different patterns of damage, with the older timber-framed structures generally faring better despite their considerable age, a finding that reinforced rather than merely illustrated the continuing relevance of the original 18th century engineering. Tourists walking through the Baisha today, admiring its orderly streets and elegant uniform facades, generally have no reason to know that the ground beneath their feet was cleared by fire following one of the deadliest natural disasters in European history, or that the walls of the buildings around them conceal a wooden skeleton engineered specifically to keep those same buildings standing through a repeat of the catastrophe that made their construction necessary in the first place. Museums in the district today house exhibits documenting the disaster and its architectural aftermath, offering visitors who seek it out a chance to see, sectioned and displayed, the same timber lattice framework hidden invisibly inside the walls of the ordinary shops and cafes surrounding them. The earthquake's 5-minute rupture, followed by an hour of flooding and 5 days of fire, produced consequences that extended across 3 continents and reshaped fields as distinct as structural engineering, government disaster response, the philosophical treatment of natural evil, and the earliest empirical foundations of a science that would not have a name for another century. None of that long thread, connecting a single November morning in 1755 to modern seismic building codes, centralized disaster response agencies, and Enlightenment philosophy's changing relationship with natural catastrophe, was visible to the survivors gathered on the flooded plaza as the tsunami withdrew for the final time. What they knew in that moment was considerably simpler. The ground had failed them, the water had failed them, and whatever the city would become afterward remained, for now, entirely unwritten. It would take decades of careful, deliberate work by engineers, by administrators, by philosophers working through the implications from studies far from Lisbon's ruined streets to write that next chapter. The city that emerged from that work still stands. The lessons it embodies about flexible structures, coordinated response, and the value of treating disaster as something to be studied and prepared for rather than simply endured, continue to inform how cities around the world think about the ground beneath them. That is where this account of Lisbon comes to rest. The story that began with an ordinary holiday morning, church bells, lit candles, ships resting quietly on a calm river, ends with streets that carry the names of the people who rebuilt them and buildings that still stand because someone once decided the ground could not simply be trusted again without asking why it had failed. The rebuilding continued long after anyone who remembered the old city had passed away. The streets grew quiet again, the way streets eventually do, and the ground, for now, stayed still. This has been Quiet History at Bedtime. If you found value in this story, a subscribe, a like, or turning on notifications helps this channel keep telling the histories that go untold. Thank you for listening and for letting this play through to the end. Good night and sleep well.